The wind carried the smell of rain across the black stone towers of Karzug, capital of the Orc Empire. Far above the city, Princess Grasha stood alone on a balcony overlooking thousands of rooftops. Beneath her feet stretched the greatest empire on the continent. Warriors trained in crowded arenas. Merchants shouted prices in packed markets. Blacksmiths hammered steel from dawn until midnight. And above every voice, beyond every sound ordinary ears could hear, came the whispers. Always the whispers. The chain weakens. The gate stirs. The sleeping king dreams. Grasha closed her glowing golden eyes. The voices immediately became louder. She sighed. That was the problem with ancient spirits. Ignoring them only encouraged them. Your Highness. An elderly servant approached carefully. Grasha turned toward him. The servant bowed. Today is the festival of ancestors. Silence, the emperor requests your presence. Silence, the nobles have arrived. Silence, the Western prince has come to ask for your hand in marriage. Grasha stared at him. The servant rubbed his forehead. That expression means no, doesn't it? Grasha nodded once. The servant sighed. That's what I thought. After 24 years, the palace staff had become surprisingly skilled at understanding the silent princess. Some even claimed they could tell entire conversations from her eyebrows alone. Unfortunately, her father could not. Several hours later, the imperial throne room overflowed with nobles. The emperor sat upon a massive throne carved from the skull of a mountain dragon. Beside him sat Grasha, silent, as always. Across the hall stood Prince Gorvak of the Western clans. He was enormous, broad shoulders, heavy armor. A beard braided into 6 separate ropes. He looked confident, far too confident. My emperor, Gorvak declared, I have defeated trolls, giants, and sea serpents. The crowd applauded. I own 7 fortresses. More applause. I command 10,000 warriors. Even more applause. Gorvak grinned and turned toward Grasha, and I humbly asked Princess Grasha to become my wife. The hall became silent. Everyone watched the princess. Grasha looked at him. Then looked away. The rejection was immediate. Several nobles coughed to hide their laughter. Gorvak blinked. Perhaps the princess did not hear me. He stepped forward. I said I wished to marry you. Grasha slowly picked up a cup of water. Then she drank from it, nothing else. The hall erupted into barely suppressed snickers. One noble nearly fell from his chair. The emperor pinched the bridge of his nose. Another failed proposal. Another disappointed noble. Another day. The spirits whispered again, louder. Closer. Near. Grasha frowned slightly. Something felt different. For years the whispers had remained distant. Today they sounded almost excited. The sensation lingered throughout the ceremony. By sunset, the annual festival filled the capital. Bonfires burned throughout the streets. Music echoed between buildings. Crowds packed every avenue. From a palace tower, Grasha watched the celebration below. Then the whispers suddenly stopped. Completely, her eyes widened, for the first time in her life. Silence, true silence. No spirits, no voices, nothing. Her heart skipped. The absence felt stranger than the whispers themselves. Slowly, she searched the crowd. Thousands of people moved through the streets. Orcs, merchants, travelers, guards. Then she saw him, a human, completely ordinary, brown hair, simple clothes, no armor, no magical aura, no royal escort. At that exact moment, the human tripped over a sleeping goat. The goat screamed. The human screamed. A fruit cart overturned. Apples exploded across the street. 3 merchants began shouting accusations. The goat somehow escaped carrying a loaf of bread. The human stood in the middle of the disaster, looking utterly confused. The spirits remained silent. Grasha stared. The human scratched his head. One merchant pointed at him. You owe me 30 silver. What? Why? You start this. The goat started this. The goat doesn't have money. That's hardly my fault. The argument continued. For the first time in years, Grasha felt something unfamiliar, curiosity. Far below, the human eventually surrendered and handed over a handful of coins. Then he looked up, directly toward the palace. Their eyes met, and somewhere deep beneath the continent, something ancient shifted in its sleep. Arlen immediately regretted looking up, not because of the palace, not because of the princess, because while he was staring toward the tower, the same goat returned and stole his second loaf of bread. That's mine, Arlen shouted. The goat ignored him. That's theft. The goat continued running. A nearby merchant crossed his arms. I warned you. You warned me about what? That goat. You can't warn someone by saying, beware. I thought it sounded mysterious. That's not a warning. That's what old men say before disappearing into forests. The merchant shrugged. The goat vanished into the crowd. Arlen stared after it. He had arrived in the capital less than 2 hours ago. He had already lost money, lost bread, and somehow become involved in a public argument with livestock. Things were going badly. Unfortunately, they were about to become much worse. High above the city, Grasha continued watching him. The silence remained, no spirits. No whispers, no warnings, nothing. For the first time since childhood, she could hear ordinary sounds without thousands of ghostly voices speaking over them. Laughter, music, conversations, the crackling of festival fires. The experience felt almost unreal. Then she noticed movement beside her. Her father approached. The emperor folded his massive arms. "You are watching something." Grasha remained silent. "You always watch something." "Silence. This is why conversations with you are difficult." Grasha slowly pointed downward. The emperor followed her gaze. His eyes narrowed. "A human." Grasha nodded. The emperor looked confused. Out of all the warriors, nobles, and visiting rulers in the city, his daughter had chosen to spend her evening observing a human who appeared to be losing a battle against a goat. The emperor stared. Arlen was now trying to negotiate with a baker. The negotiations seemed unsuccessful. The baker eventually threw a turnip at him. The emperor blinked. "That one." Grasha nodded again. The emperor became even more confused. Meanwhile, Arlen finally escaped the market and found an inn. At least he thought it was an inn. The sign outside showed a smiling boar holding a mug that seemed trustworthy. He entered. A giant orc bartender looked up. "Room." "Yes." "Money." "Yes." The bartender nodded. "Good. Last week a bard tried paying with poetry." "What happened?" "We made him write it. And he paid money." Arlen laughed. The bartender did not. Arlen slowly stopped laughing. Several hours later, after finally obtaining a room, he collapsed onto the bed. His body ached from travel. Tomorrow would be easier. Tomorrow he would register his trading permits, sell his goods, earn some money, then leave. Simple, peaceful. Normal. At that exact moment, 3 palace guards kicked open the inn door downstairs. Arlen heard shouting, then more shouting, then screaming, then somebody yelled, "Which one of you is Arlen?" Arlen sat upright. His soul nearly left his body. Downstairs, the bartender answered, "The human." "Yes." "The one renting room 7. "Yes." A pause followed, then the bartender shouted upward, "Room 7, the Empire wants you." Arlen's face turned pale. "The Empire?" Another voice answered, "The princess has summoned you." Silence filled the room. Arlen stared at the ceiling. The ceiling offered no advice. He looked toward the window. The window offered even less. Slowly he stood. Why? Nobody answered. Did I accidentally insult someone important? Silence. Is this about the goat? Still silence. Arlen opened his door. Several armored guards waited outside. One stepped forward. Arlen of Brindle Village. Possibly. I'm trying to determine how much trouble I'm in before answering. The guard looked genuinely impressed. That's actually sensible. Thank you. Unfortunately, it won't help. The guard handed him a royal summons. Arlen stared at the seal. The imperial seal, the highest authority in the continent. His hands immediately began shaking. Why does the princess want me? The guards exchanged glances. Nobody seemed to know. Finally, one guard shrugged, honestly. Yes. We were hoping you could tell us. Far away inside the palace, Grasha stood beside a window. The silence around her remained absolute. Then, after hours of quiet, a single whisper finally returned. Only one, only 4 words. "The chosen one arrives." For the first time in years, Grasha felt afraid and strangely curious, because she knew the whisper wasn't talking about a king, or a hero, or a legendary warrior. It was talking about the human who couldn't even protect his bread from a goat. The palace was far larger than Arlen had imagined. That became painfully obvious after he got lost for the 5th time. A guard walked beside him. "We passed this hallway already." "I know. Then why did you turn left again?" "I was testing a theory." "What theory?" "That all palace hallways secretly led somewhere useful." The guard stared at him, and, "They don't." The guard sighed. At last they reached a pair of enormous doors. 2 royal sentries stood beside them. Neither moved, neither blinked, neither appeared particularly happy to be alive. Arlen suddenly felt nervous. "Before I go inside." The guard looked at him. "Yes." "If the princess hates me, how quickly will I know?" "Immediately." "And if the emperor hates me?" "Also immediately." "And if both hate me?" The guard thought about it. "You probably won't have enough time to worry about it." "That's comforting." "It wasn't meant to be." The doors opened, Arlen stepped inside. The throne chamber was nearly empty. The emperor sat upon his throne. Several advisors stood nearby. A few shamans watched from the shadows. And beside the throne stood Princess Grasha. For a moment nobody spoke. Arlen immediately understood why people talked about her, not because she was beautiful, though she certainly was, not because she looked powerful, though she certainly did. It was her eyes. They felt as though they were examining every thought inside his head. Arlen swallowed, then accidentally waved. Nobody waved back. The emperor looked confused. One advisor looked offended. A shaman appeared personally insulted. Arlen slowly lowered his hand. Right. Silence filled the room. Then Grasha stepped forward. The entire court watched. The emperor leaned forward. The shamans held their breath. One advisor looked seconds away from fainting. Grasha stopped directly in front of Arlen. Her golden eyes locked onto his. Then she spoke. You arrived. The room froze. Several advisors nearly collapsed. One shaman dropped a ceremonial staff. The emperor's eyes widened. Arlen blinked. Yes. Grasha continued staring. Arlen stared back. More silence followed. Finally, he scratched his head. Should I say something important? Nobody answered. The emperor stood abruptly. She spoke. Everyone jumped. She actually spoke. Another advisor fainted. Nobody seemed surprised. The emperor pointed at Arlen. You. Arlen pointed at himself. Me. Why did she speak to you? I have absolutely no idea. Neither do we. Then we're making excellent progress. The emperor narrowed his eyes. Arlen immediately regretted the joke. To his surprise, Grasha's lips twitched slightly, almost a smile. The emperor noticed. Every advisor noticed. The room became even more uncomfortable. A shaman stepped forward. Your Highness. Grasha looked toward him. Can you hear us? Silence. The shaman waited. Nothing. Then Grasha looked back toward Arlen. The shaman nearly cried. Only him again. Another advisor whispered. This is becoming humiliating. A third advisor nodded. It truly is. The emperor sat down heavily. For years, healers, shamans, priests, kings, queens, generals, and scholars had failed to make the princess speak. A random human traitor arrived. Suddenly, she was having conversations. The situation felt deeply unfair. Then Grasha spoke again. Come. Everyone froze. Arlen pointed at himself. Me again. She nodded. The emperor immediately stood. No. Grasha looked at her father. The emperor crossed his arms. No. She continued staring. The emperor stared back. The entire court watched what appeared to be a silent argument. 1 minute passed, then another. Finally, the emperor groaned. You inherited this stubbornness from your mother. Grasha's expression somehow looked victorious. Arlen wasn't entirely sure how, yet it did. The princess turned and began walking. Then she stopped, looked back, waited. Arlen realized she expected him to follow. Oh. He hurried after her. The advisors erupted into whispers. The emperor buried his face in his hands. The palace corridors stretched ahead. Neither spoke at first. Eventually, Arlen glanced sideways. You know, this is the strangest day of my life. Grasha looked at him. Really? Without question. She considered that, then spoke again. What happened yesterday? Arlen laughed. Yesterday, a chicken attacked me. Grasha blinked. A chicken. It was extremely aggressive. Silence, then to Arlen's surprise, the corner of her mouth lifted slightly, a tiny smile, the first genuine smile he had seen from her. For some reason, seeing it felt more shocking than entering the palace. Far behind them, hidden deep within the oldest part of the palace, something stirred. An ancient stone door trembled, dust fell from forgotten runes, and from the darkness beyond the door came a whisper that no longer sounded distant, a whisper that sounded awake. The silence is breaking. For the first time in centuries, another voice answered, and so is the seal. Months later, stories about Princess Grasha and the human named Arlen had spread across every corner of the continent. The missing months had changed everything. Together they had crossed the ashen frontier, survived the ruins of Velkar, uncovered records left behind by the lost civilization that once united humans and orcs, and discovered the truth behind the voices Grasha had heard her entire life. The whispers had never been random spirits. They were echoes of ancient guardians. Thousands of years ago, when a disaster threatened both races, those guardians sacrificed themselves to imprison an entity known as the Hollow King. Arlen's ancestors had helped create the prison. Grasha's bloodline had been tasked with maintaining it. Separated by history, their families had unknowingly carried two halves of the same responsibility. During their journey, political conspiracies had collapsed. Assassins had been exposed. Corrupt nobles seeking to awaken the Hollow King for power had been defeated. one bounty hunter had accidentally captured himself while attempting to arrest Arlen. Nobody ever let him forget it. Most importantly, Grasha had changed. The princess who once lived behind silence had begun speaking, slowly, carefully, but genuinely. At first, she spoke only to Arlen, then to her father, then to trusted friends. By the end of the journey, people no longer feared her silence, because she no longer hid behind it. Now she stood beside Arlen within the deepest chamber beneath the imperial capital. The ancient seal surrounded them. Runes glowed across the stone walls. The Hollow King stirred beyond the barrier. Its voice thundered through the darkness. You cannot stop what is coming. Arlen sighed. You know, every ancient evil says that. The voice paused. What? Seriously, every single one. Grasha nodded. He has a point. The Hollow King sounded offended. I am the end of WRLDS. Yes, I have waited thousands of years. Still not original. The ancient entity fell silent. Even cosmic horrors apparently disliked criticism. The moment of humor faded. The seal continued cracking. The final battle had arrived. Ancient energy surged throughout the chamber. The guardians' voices returned, not as whispers, as a chorus. The heir. The descendant. The final choice. Grasha looked toward Arlen. Arlen looked toward Grasha. For years she had feared speaking. For years he had doubted himself. Neither felt like the same person anymore. The guardians revealed the final truth. The prison could not be repaired through magic. It required unity, the very thing humans and orcs had abandoned centuries ago. The seal needed both bloodlines willingly joined together, not through war, not through duty, through trust, through choice. Grasha laughed softly. After everything. Arlen smiled. It was something simple. The guardians answered. The greatest things often are. The two stepped forward together. Their hands met. Ancient light flooded the chamber. The fractured runes reignited. The Hollow King roared. The entire continent trembled. For one terrifying moment, it seemed as though the prison would fail. Then the ancient barrier stabilized. The cracks vanished. The darkness retreated. And for the first time in thousands of years, silence filled the chamber. True silence, peaceful silence. The Hollow King was gone. The guardians were finally free. Their duty had ended. As their voices faded, one final whisper reached Grasha. Live. Then they disappeared forever. Several months later, the Orc Empire celebrated unlike ever before. Humans and orcs stood together in the capital. Trade routes reopened. Old grudges slowly faded. Not everything became perfect overnight. People were still people. Orcs were still orcs. Arguments continued. Politics remained politics. One merchant still claimed Arlen owed him money from the goat incident. Some things never changed. Inside the palace gardens, Grasha sat beside Arlen. The evening was quiet, comfortably quiet, not lonely, not painful, just peaceful. You talk a lot now, Arlen said. Grasha raised an eyebrow. You complain a lot. I always complained. True. Arlen grinned. Remember when nobody thought you'd ever speak. Remember when nobody thought you were important. That was only because nobody knew me. Arlen, fine, there were many reasons. For a moment they laughed together. Then Grasha looked toward the city, toward the people living ordinary lives, toward the future. I used to think silence protected everyone. Arlen listened. I was wrong. She squeezed his hand. The thing that saved everyone was reaching out to someone else. Arlen squeezed her hand back. Good thing you picked me. Grasha smiled. Actually, I tried speaking to the goat first. Arlen froze. What? It ran away. You are joking. I am. Arlen stared, then both of them burst out laughing. The sound echoed through the gardens. No prophecies, no ancient horrors. No whispers, only two people who had changed each other's lives. Above them, the stars shone over a world finally at peace. And for the first time in her life, Grasha looked toward the future not with fear, but with hope. The silent princess was silent no longer, and the ordinary human who had arrived with nothing had become part of a story that would be remembered for generations. Their adventure had ended. Their life together was only beginning.